I taught literature for 35 years. Fitzgerald, Chekhov, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I stood in front of teenagers who would rather have been anywhere else in the world, and I tried to make them understand what it felt like to be inside a story, to be so deep inside the current of something that you couldn't see where it was taking you until the water changed under your feet. I told them about Gatsby reaching for the green light. I told them about Anna Karenina and the particular mathematics of a life that chooses feeling over reason. I told them, in my careful teacher's voice, that the most powerful narratives are the ones we write for ourselves, that the stories we believe about our own lives are the ones we will sacrifice the most to protect. I think about those classroom conversations a great deal now. I sit in the apartment in Portland that my daughter Claire found for me, the one with the single window facing a parking structure and the radiator that knocks in February. And I think about the things I said with such confidence to all those children. And I think, Lawrence, you should have listened to yourself. I am 69 years old. I lost $420,000 in Thailand. This is not a story about a bad investment. This is not a story about a scam I stumbled into by accident. This is a story about a man who taught the difference between literary romance and reality for 3.5 decades, and who failed, at the age of 67, to apply any of that learning to his own life. Because the story he was living felt too beautiful to fact-check. Because when you are inside the story, all the warning signs read like dramatic tension. And dramatic tension, every good teacher knows, is what keeps you turning pages. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the son of a high school football coach and a bookkeeper who read everything she could get her hands on. My mother is where I got it. The love of words, the conviction that a sentence constructed with precision was one of the finer things a person could make. I went to Ohio State, studied English literature, and became a teacher because I could not imagine doing anything else. 35 years at Jefferson High School in Portland, Oregon, department head for 12 of those years. The kind of teacher students wrote about in college application essays, which I know because several of them told me so. I was married to a woman named Ellen for 26 years, and when Ellen died of a stroke in 2016, I grieved in the way that people grieve when the person who knew them best is suddenly gone, quietly, thoroughly, and for longer than anyone around me understood. My parents had died within 18 months of each other the year before Ellen, and the inheritance they left me, combined with the teacher's pension and the house sale, after I decided the 4-bedroom house was too large for one aging man, gave me $420,000 in liquid assets by the time I retired in 2019 at 67. I want to tell you about the $420,000 before I tell you anything else, because I think the provenance of the money matters to the story. It was not abstract capital. It was my mother's careful decades of bookkeeping applied to her own modest savings. It was my father coaching Friday nights under stadium lights for 30 years. It was Ellen's half of a house we had bought together in 1990 and cared for and planted a garden in and raised our daughter in, and which I had sold because every room in it was a place she had been. That $420,000 was not a number. It was the material residue of lives that had been lived with discipline and love. And I want you to understand what it meant so that you understand what it meant to lose it. Thailand. I had never been before Ellen died. She had wanted to go, had clipped articles about Chiang Mai from travel magazines and stacked them in the drawer of her nightstand. And after she was gone, I found them there, and I could not throw them away, and I could not read them. And they stayed in that drawer until I sold the house. And I do not know what happened to them after that. When I retired, when I was trying to decide what to do with a freedom I had not asked for and did not feel ready for, a colleague named Mike, a history teacher who had retired 2 years before me and who had subsequently spent 3 months in Southeast Asia on what he described as the best decision of his adult life, suggested Bangkok. Not Chiang Mai, which was Ellen's dream and felt, to me, like a place I should not go alone because I had promised to go with her. Bangkok. Start there, see what you think. I thought I would stay a month. I stayed 4. I want to be precise about what Bangkok did to me in those first weeks, because I think it is important to describe the sensation accurately rather than the way people usually describe it, which involves a lot of adjectives about vibrancy and energy and transformation that do not quite catch the specific thing I experienced. What Bangkok did was make me feel like a character in a novel again. After 3 years of grief and routine, and the muted color palette of a life that was being managed rather than lived, Bangkok was saturated. The sounds were too loud, the smells were too complex, the food was too good, the streets were too crowded, the temples were too beautiful, and the whole sensory experience of being there was so overwhelming that I simply did not have the bandwidth to also be sad. I walked for hours every day. I ate things I could not name. I took the BTS SkyTrain to stations I had never heard of, and walked in whatever direction seemed interesting. I felt, for the first time in 3 years, like I was inside the action of something rather than watching it from a window. I met Praew in October, 6 weeks into my first Bangkok visit. Not at a bar, not at a tourist venue. At a used English bookshop on a side street off Sukhumvit, one of those eccentric Bangkok institutions that somehow survive by serving the city's expat academic community and the Thai university students who want to read Orwell or Hemingway in the original. She was looking at the poetry section, which was small, a single shelf with the inevitable Bukowski and Neruda and a worn copy of Mary Oliver that had someone else's annotations in the margins. She was 26, I would later learn, though she looked younger, with the attentive, slightly serious expression of someone who reads carefully rather than quickly. She was holding a copy of Pablo Neruda's 20 love poems, which I know is almost impossibly literary a detail for a story like this, and which I realize now was either a coincidence or was not, and I have spent a great deal of time being unable to decide which. I said something about the book, she responded. We talked for perhaps 20 minutes, there in the poetry aisle, and she spoke about the Neruda with a genuine and specific engagement that I found immediately compelling, in the way that you find genuinely rare things compelling, not because they are spectacular, but because they are unexpected. She ran an online boutique, she told me, selling handmade accessories. She had studied design for 2 years before the money ran out, and she had built the business from her apartment in Bang Na, which is a district in the southeastern part of Bangkok, residential and unglamorous, far from the tourist zones. She was practical about her circumstances, without complaint. She was curious about mine. She asked what I had taught, and when I told her, she said, and I want to be precise about this because I have turned it over many times. Do you think the stories we love tell us something true about ourselves, or do they tell us what we want to believe? I was 67 years old, and I had been a literature teacher for 35 years, and I had not been asked a question that interesting by anyone in longer than I could precisely remember. That is the honest answer to why everything that followed was possible. Looking back, and this is what I do now, from the apartment in Portland, looking back with the specific clarity that only arrives after you have lost the thing that was blocking your view, I can see the architecture of what happened in those early months, with a precision that was simply not available to me while I was inside it. The bookshop meeting led to coffee. The coffee led to dinner, at a small restaurant in the On Nut neighborhood that she said served the best tom kha gai, coconut milk soup with galangal and lemongrass, she had ever eaten anywhere, which turned out to be accurate. The dinner led to a walk along the canal near her neighborhood, past the long-tail boats and the spirit houses on the banks, and the particular quality of Bangkok evening that is thick and warm and smells of jasmine and exhaust, and something frying somewhere always. By the end of that walk, I was, whatever the precise word is for the thing that happens to you at 67, when the grief has been sitting in your chest for 3 years, and something suddenly makes it shift sideways. I realize now that I narrate those early months in the past tense, but with a tenderness that is still there. That is the nostalgic regret. I cannot hate the memory of those weeks, even now, knowing everything I know. I remember the coffee place in Ari that became our morning ritual when I extended my stay into November, the one with the single barista who called me by name after the 3rd visit. I remember the afternoon she took me to Chatuchak Weekend Market, and we spent 4 hours there, and she translated the vendors' jokes for me, and I bought a small ceramic pot that I still have, one of the few things I brought back. I remember, and this is the detail I return to most, the evening she read to me from the Neruda, in Thai first, then in English. her voice moving between the two languages as though they were rooms in the same house. And I thought, with a fullness of feeling that I had genuinely not expected to feel again, this is what it means to be alive. I am telling you this not as an excuse but as a context, because I want you to understand the specific quality of the trap, which was not crude. It was not constructed from greed alone. Whatever Praew felt, there were moments in those early months that I believe were real, or real enough that no instrument I possessed could have measured the difference. I taught Anna Karenina for 20 years, and I always told my students the same thing. Tolstoy's genius was making you understand why she made every choice she made, even as you saw the train coming from the first page. I understood, at 67, sitting in that coffee shop in Ari, why Anna made her choices. I was making mine. Mike, when I told him about Praew in November during a phone call. He had gone back to Portland in September, and was already, I could tell, slightly concerned by my extended stay. Said something that I heard clearly and processed as creative interference rather than wisdom. He said, "Lawrence, be careful. The dynamic there, for men your age, it's just be careful." He did not say more than that. He was a careful man himself, a historian, uncomfortable with statements he could not fully support with evidence. What he meant was evident enough in what he did not say. I told him it was different, that she was not from that world, that she was a reader, a thinker, that she had genuine curiosity about ideas, that I was not naive, that I had taught literature for 35 years and I could tell the difference between performance and authenticity. Mike said, "Okay, Lawrence," and we talked about other things. "I want to tell you about December and January, because those 2 months contain the texture of what it felt like to be inside this, and to be unable to see it clearly from that position." Praew had a quality of attention that I think was the thing I responded to most deeply. A genuine interest in ideas, in the specific way I thought about things, in what 35 years of teaching literature had given me and taken from me. She asked questions that opened rather than closed. She remembered details from previous conversations and returned to them weeks later with a follow-up thought. She sent me photographs, not of herself, which might have felt calculated, but of things she encountered. A market stall where someone was selling hand-lettered scrolls, a temple frieze she thought I would find beautiful, a cloud formation over the Chao Phraya River that she described as looking like something from a Japanese woodblock print. I have thought about those photographs many times since. I cannot determine whether the person who took them and sent them was performing or simply was. That uncertainty is the thing I live with. We had, in those months, a series of conversations about literature that I would rank among the finest I have had as an adult. About whether translation was betrayal or love. About the specific loneliness of a narrator who knows more than the reader and chooses what to reveal. About why certain stories survive their centuries and others do not. She was not a literature scholar, but she thought with an originality that formal training sometimes inhibits, and being with her had the quality of being in a very good classroom where I was also the student. I want to say this because I think people who hear this story assume it was primarily physical or primarily transactional, and it was neither of those things, primarily. It was primarily intellectual, and that is its own kind of vulnerability, possibly more complete than the others. The money began before the marriage, which is important to say clearly because I think people assume the financial exploitation begins with the legal ceremony. It does not. It begins with the family. In December, 2 months into the relationship, Praew told me, quietly and without drama, that her mother had a debt problem. Not her debt, the mother's, accumulated over years of borrowing from an informal creditor in Bang Na to cover the costs of the household after Praew's father had left. The amount outstanding was 180,000 baht, which at the exchange rate in December worked out to approximately $5,400. Praew was not asking me for the money. She was telling me the situation existed, in the way she told me about everything, as a fact of her life that she managed without self-pity. She was not asking. I offered. I want to describe what that offering felt like from the inside, because I think this is the thing that is hardest for people outside the situation to understand. It did not feel like a transaction. It felt like an expression of something, of the desire to relieve a burden from someone I cared about, of the gratitude I felt toward the relationship that had returned color to my life after 3 years of gray. $5,000 was not nothing to me, but it was not devastating either. It was a gesture, the way you bring flowers, the way you make dinner. I transferred the money through a currency exchange service and did not think about it much afterward. I returned to Portland for Christmas, spent the holiday with Claire and her family, and was back in Bangkok in February. I had, by this point, rented a longer stay apartment in the Asok area. A clean and simply furnished one-bedroom with a small balcony and a view of the BTS line that I found, improbably, romantic rather than urban. Praew came most evenings. On the weekends, we went to places she knew. The temple at Wat Pho, where she explained the reclining Buddha with a scholar's specificity that still surprises me in retrospect. The flower market at Pa Klong Talat, open through the night, where I bought her gardenias 3 weeks running because she mentioned once that they were her favorite. The mother's debt, it turned out, was not fully resolved by the 180,000 baht. There was an additional obligation. I did not receive a clear accounting, just a gradual picture assembled from Praw's careful, never dramatic reports. To a different creditor, this one connected to the mother's attempt several years earlier to open a small food stall that had not survived its first year. The amount attached to this obligation was 220,000 baht, approximately $6,600. I transferred it in March. By this point, I had given $12,000 total to the family situation, and I had done it voluntarily, without being asked in any direct or explicit way. I want to be clear about this because it is the specific mechanism and the specific thing I was not able to see clearly at the time. I was never directly asked for money, was told about situations, and I chose to respond to them. The distinction seemed important to me then. It seems rather less important to me now. The marriage conversation began in April. Not dramatically, it arrived the way everything with Praew arrived, as a quiet, thoughtful statement rather than a request. She said she had been thinking about the future, about what it would mean for her to have a stable life rather than a provisional one, about whether there was something more permanent that might be possible between us. She said she understood if I thought it was too soon. She said she would not press. She was 26, and I was 67, and we had been together for 6 months. And I sat in the Asok apartment with the BTS train running past the window, and I thought about what more permanent meant, and what it would mean for me to build something here, in this city, in this life that had opened up in ways I had not thought possible. And I said I had been thinking about it too. The months between April and August have a pattern, looking back, that I can now trace with the precision of someone rereading a text they have studied too long. In April, when I said I had been thinking about the future too, Praew's engagement with the apartment life began to shift subtly. She was there most evenings still, but occasionally not, citing visits to her mother in Bang Na that she described briefly rather than with the detail with which she normally described her days. Her mother's health, she said, had not been good. She did not elaborate. In May, 2 financial situations emerged within 3 weeks of each other. The first was a legal dispute the mother was involved in with a neighbor, a shared wall, a building inspector, a requirement for documentation that apparently needed a lawyer to resolve. Approximately 95,000 baht, around $2,800. The second was a diagnosis for an aunt on the father's side. The father who was not in the picture, who had left years before, whose family was still connected to Praew's household in ways I did not fully understand. That required treatment costing 140,000 baht, approximately $4,200. I transferred both amounts within a week of being told about each. Looking back, I understand the close timing as structural rather than coincidental. At the time, I understood it as the specific relentlessness of financial difficulty in a household without a cushion. I called Mike in May. I told him obliquely that the family situation was more complicated than I had initially understood. Mike listened to the oblique version and said, "Lawrence, are you being asked for money or are you being told about situations?" I said I was being told about situations. He said, "That's the same thing, just with better manners." I told him I would think about it. I thought about it and did not arrive at a conclusion that required me to change anything, which is not the same as thinking, as I now understand. The months of June and July had an acceleration I can track in retrospect. 115,000 baht in June for what Praew described as a lump payment to the oldest and most pressing creditor, because the mother was anxious about it and Praew wanted her to come to the wedding without that weight. 88,000 baht in July for repairs to the Bang Na apartment that the landlord demanded before renewing the lease. Each amount, in isolation, was explicable. As a pattern across 9 months, they assembled into something else entirely, and the assembly was only visible once I had the sentence from the taxi to provide the frame. I told Claire in May. The silence that followed was long enough that I said her name to check the connection. Then she said, carefully, "Dad, can we talk about this when I see you?" I flew back to Portland in June, and we had the conversation over 3 evenings, and Claire said everything a loving daughter should say in that situation. And I heard everything she said, and I explained my position with the patience of a man who has spent his career helping young people understand things they do not yet have the experience to see. And by the end of the 3rd evening, we were still in our respective positions, and I flew back to Bangkok 2 weeks later. I think about those evenings now with a quality of sadness that is different from what I feel about everything else. Because Claire was right, and I was condescending to her clarity in the way that people are condescending to clarity when it is standing between them and what they want. The sin sod, bride price, was raised in June, the traditional Thai gift from the groom's family to the bride's family, a practice I knew about, had read about, understood intellectually, as a marker of the groom's respect and capacity to care for his wife, rather than a purchase price. Though the distinction between those two things is one I have complicated feelings about now. Praew said her family expected something. Not a large amount, she said. Just something that showed intention. We discussed it with the help of Kun Narong, a Thai lawyer with bilingual skills, who had been recommended by an expat forum that Mike had pointed me to after our November conversation. Kun Narong was professional and thorough, and he explained the sin sod custom accurately and noted that foreigners were under no legal obligation to participate, but that the family might expect it. We settled on 300,000 baht, approximately $9,000. I paid it at the family meeting in Bang Na, at the mother's apartment, where I sat in a plastic chair and ate food I was too nervous to taste, and smiled at people whose names I kept confusing, and who were smiling back in a way that I thought was warmth, and that I now cannot fully decode. The wedding was in August, small, by Thai standards, 20 people, a civil registration at the district office in Bang Na, and a dinner at a restaurant in the On Nut area afterward. I wore the dark suit I had brought from Portland that was slightly too heavy for the Bangkok August heat, but that I had worn to Ellen's funeral, and that seemed, in some private way, I did not examine too closely, like the right choice for a formal occasion. Praew wore white. She was, genuinely, one of the most beautiful people I have ever stood next to in my life. And I want to say this plainly, because denying it would be a dishonesty in the opposite direction from the one this story is usually told in. Whatever she was doing, she was also, in that moment, present. I believe that. The marriage certificate was signed on a Tuesday morning in August. The mother's remaining debts, and there were remaining debts, a figure that emerged in the weeks after the wedding with the inevitability of something that was always going to emerge, were paid within the week. The total across all the family obligations that I had funded, from the first 180,000 baht in December to the post-wedding payments in August and September, came to approximately 4.2 million baht. At the average exchange rate across that 9-month period, that was $126,000. I will come back to the full accounting later. For now, I want to tell you how the discovery happened. The discovery happened at a restaurant in the Selam area on a Thursday evening in November, 3 months after the wedding. We had been having dinner with a couple Praew knew, a Thai friend from university and her boyfriend, and there had been, over the course of the evening, more alcohol than was typical for a Thursday. I think it was a Wednesday. No, it was definitely Thursday, because the next morning, I had a phone call scheduled with Claire at 9, and I remember thinking about it during the taxi ride home. Praew had had 3 glasses of something rice-based and sweet that I had not tried, and in the taxi on the way back to the Asok apartment she was more relaxed than usual, more unguarded, and she said something. I am going to try to reproduce it as accurately as I can, because the precise words matter. She said, My mother is so happy now. She was so worried. She didn't know if it would work, with a Farang, and it worked. She fell asleep in the taxi before I could respond to this, or before I could process it enough to respond. I sat in the dark back of the taxi watching the Bangkok night go past the window, and I turned the sentence over and looked at it from different angles, the way you look at a line of poetry that means something you cannot quite articulate yet. She didn't know if it would work, with a Farang. And it worked. It, not us, not the relationship. It, the thing that was being attempted, the thing that needed to work. I did not sleep that night. I watched the BTS train go past the apartment window approximately 14 times. I counted. While I sat on the balcony with a glass of water I did not drink, and thought about everything with the particular clarity that 3 months of not quite right details suddenly achieve when a single sentence provides the lens to focus them through. The way the family had known, at the Bang Na dinner, where every item of financial information was positioned in the conversation. The way the debts had always emerged in the week after some significant emotional milestone. After she had said she loved me for the first time. After the sin sod was paid. After the wedding certificate. The way Praew's mother had looked at me across the dinner table with an expression I had read as maternal warmth and that I now read differently. The way the word it sounded in Praew's relaxed, slightly drunk voice in the back of the taxi. Like a project. Like a thing that had been attempted and had succeeded. I want to describe what that night was like in a way that goes beyond the insomnia and the train and the water glass, because I think the specific character of the suffering matters to understanding this kind of loss. It was not rage. I want to be clear about that. A man with a different psychological architecture might have felt rage in that apartment on that night, and the rage would have been legitimate. What I felt was the particular grief of a reader who has been so deep inside a story that the ending, when it becomes visible, does not cancel the story that came before it. The coffee shop in Ari was still the coffee shop in Ari. The Neruda evening was still the Neruda evening. The walks along the canal, the Chatuchak morning, the gardenias. None of the past events changed their character simply because the frame around them turned out to be different from what I had believed. And grieving the authentic parts of something that was also inauthentic is, I think, one of the more specifically painful experiences available to a person who cares about the distinction between real and constructed. I stayed on that balcony until the sky began to change, sometime around 5 in the morning, and then I went inside and sat at the table where I kept my books, and I opened the volume of Chekhov I had been reading. I was rereading The Lady with the Dog, which I had taught probably 30 times. And I read the last few pages, the ones where Gurov realizes that what he thought was an episode has become his entire real life. I had taught those pages more times than I could count. I had never, until that morning in the Asak apartment with the Bangkok light just beginning through the window, fully understood what they cost Chekhov to write. I asked Kun Narang the next morning to prepare a full accounting. He took 3 days. The number he came back with was this. Over 9 months, from December through August, I had transferred a total of $126,000 to or for Praew's family. The largest single transfer was $38,000 in September, for a debt the mother owed to a private creditor that Praew had described as urgent in a way that implied something dangerous if it was not resolved, and which I had transferred without fully understanding the nature, or the debtor, or the verification I should have sought. The sin sod of $9,000. A series of smaller amounts across the months. $4,200 in March for the food stall obligation. $7,800 in June for a roof repair at the Bang Na apartment that I had never seen. $3,100 in July for a younger brother's schooling costs. $5,000 in the weeks immediately after the wedding for expenses I could no longer itemize clearly. $126,000 in 9 months. In transfers I had made voluntarily, never asked directly, always reported rather than requested. And then Kun Narang told me the rest. The online boutique, it turned out, had not been generating significant income for some time, a fact that Praew had not exactly hidden, but that I had not specifically verified, accepting the general impression of an active business that a series of conversations had created without being literally told it was successful. The family's creditor situation, when Kun Narang traced it with the help of some local inquiries, suggested the debt structure was more extensive than what had been disclosed, and that some of the creditors had been paid before the marriage, apparently on the expectation of the marriage, and my involvement providing the resolution. Before, the debts had been committed against the expectation of what I would provide, not after I was in the picture. Before, I confronted Praew on a Saturday afternoon. I had spent 3 days preparing what I wanted to say, the way I prepared for difficult classroom discussions about morally complex texts, with attention to the specific language, because language was where I was most competent and most likely to be clear rather than emotional. She listened to everything I said. She did not deny the family debts. She did not deny the amounts. What she said, when I had finished, was, "My family needed help. You wanted to help." Both of those things were true. She said it without anger and without defensiveness, with a matter-of-fact quality that I found more difficult to respond to than any of the responses I had prepared for. She was not wrong. Both of those things had been true. The question was what else had also been true at the same time, and whether the coexistence of those true things and the other things constituted something that had a name I did not want to say in the Asok apartment on a Saturday afternoon. I want to tell you something about that conversation that I have not told anyone else, including Claire. I did not feel, sitting across from Praew in the apartment while she said both of those things were true, that I was sitting across from a purely calculating person. I felt, and I know how this sounds, and I know what it means about me that I felt it. I felt that I was sitting across from someone who had done something in which love and strategy had coexisted in proportions neither of us could now accurately separate. That whatever calculation had been present at the beginning had become complicated by the months in the coffee shop in Ari, and the walks along the canal, and the evening with the Neruda, and things I cannot prove, and do not need to prove to carry with me. I think this is the most honest thing I can say about it, and I think it is also the thing that made the loss of it so specific and so hard. I flew back to Portland in December. The financial total, including the $126,000 transferred to and for the family, the sin sod, the wedding costs, the apartment rent across 11 months, the flights, the daily living expenses, and the $8,400 in legal fees to Kun Narong, was $163,000 spent and not returnable. The remaining $257,000 of the original $420,000 was intact in my U.S. accounts, untouched, because nothing had been taken from me that I had not given. This is the specific shape of this particular story's financial outcome, which is different from the ones where accounts are emptied or properties are encumbered. The money was given. I gave it. The giving was done in conditions that I believe were not fully honest, but the giving was mine. The marriage was annulled the following spring, on grounds that Kun Narong outlined and that I will not detail here. I did not contest the annulment. I was in Portland by then, in the apartment with the parking structure view and the knocking radiator, having that conversation with Claire I should have had in June. I am 69 years old. I have $257,000 in accounts that I guard with the vigilance of someone who has learned a lesson at the only price that actually teaches it. My pension covers my living expenses. I am not destitute. I am diminished, in the specific way that a man is diminished when the last large romantic belief of his life turns out to have been, at least in part, a story he was writing for an audience that needed something from him. I think about what I taught all those years. I think about what I told those teenagers about the stories we write for ourselves. I think Fitzgerald had it right, actually, though not in the way I used to teach it. The green light is not really about the past. It is about the specific human capacity to believe that what we most desire is just ahead of us, just within reach, and to move toward it with everything we have regardless of what the water under our feet is telling us. If you are reading this, and you are someone who loves stories, who believes, as I believed, that love is the most important narrative a life can contain, I want to say something to you specifically, not as a warning against feeling, but as a warning about the vulnerability that feeling creates. The people most susceptible to this kind of loss are not the ones who lack intelligence or experience. They are the ones who believe most deeply in the possibility of genuine connection. That belief is not wrong. But it requires, alongside it, the clear-eyed accounting that I refused to perform because accounting felt like it was writing the wrong kind of story. Ask for the accounting, not because you distrust, because trust without verification is not trust, it is hope. And hope, as any good literature teacher will tell you, is not a reliable narrator. I still have the ceramic pot from Chatuchak. It sits on the windowsill above the parking structure. Some mornings the light hits it in a way that reminds me of something I cannot quite name, and I let myself sit with that for a moment, and then I make coffee and read whatever I am reading, and the day continues. That is the most honest ending I can offer. There are things I know now that I want to say as plainly as I can, because the plain version is the useful one. The first is about the reporting mechanism. Every financial transfer I made across those 9 months was preceded not by a direct request, but by a report. I was told about a situation. I responded to the situation. This distinction between being asked and being told is one I kept returning to in my own mind, as evidence that the arrangement was something other than what it was, because in my understanding, a direct request carries an obligation that a mere report does not. What I failed to account for is that a person who understands the psychology of their audience will never make a direct request when a well-constructed report achieves the same result, without activating the defenses that a direct request might trigger. Praew understood, whether through instinct or intention, that I would respond to need rather than to demand. The difference in delivery did not change the outcome. The second is about the use of emotional milestones as financial triggers. Looking at the transfer timeline that Kun Narong assembled, the correlation between significant relational moments, the first declaration of feeling, the marriage conversation in April, the sinsod, the wedding, the marriage certificate, and the emergence of new financial situations in the weeks immediately following, is not something I can attribute to coincidence with any intellectual honesty. Each milestone was followed within 2 to 3 weeks by a new reported need. The milestone and the need were not connected in any explanation I was given. They were connected in the timing. I did not notice the timing while I was inside it. I notice it with exhausting clarity now. The third is about verification, which is the lesson every story in this series eventually arrives at, and which I want to say in the language of someone who taught literature rather than finance, because I think the literary frame is actually more accurate than the financial one. Verification is not distrust. It is not the opposite of love. It is, in fact, what love requires when love is genuine, and not merely the story we are writing about love. Every narrative I taught my students to analyze required them to distinguish between what a narrator claims and what the evidence in the text supports. A reliable narrator shows you what they say they are showing you. An unreliable narrator shows you a curated version. The question is not whether you trust the narrator. The question is whether you do the work of reading the text itself, not just the narrator's description of it. I spent 35 years teaching this distinction, and I did not apply it to the text of my own life, when the text was the most important one I had ever been given to read. Ask for the documentation, not the report, the documentation. Ask to see the debt. Ask to speak to the creditor. Ask for the receipt, not because you are suspicious, because you are literate. And being literate means reading what is actually on the page, not only what you are told is on the page. I am 69 years old. I have $257,000 in accounts that I guard with the vigilance of a man who has learned the only lesson that actually costs something to learn. My pension pays for the apartment and the books and the coffee and the modest daily expenses of a retired literature teacher in Portland, Oregon. I am not comfortable in the way I imagined I would be at this point in my life. I am not destitute. I have Claire, who was kinder to me after I came home than I had any right to expect, and who continues to be the finest thing I have produced in 69 years of living, which is saying something, because I also produced 35 years of students who went on to read things they would not otherwise have read. I still have the ceramic pot from Chatuchak. It sits on the windowsill above the parking structure. Some mornings the light comes through the window and hits it at an angle that reminds me of something I cannot precisely name. The light in Bangkok in the early evenings, perhaps, or the quality of attention that those months had, when everything felt saturated and consequential and present. I let myself sit with that feeling for a moment, and then I make coffee and read whatever I am reading, and the day continues. I taught my students that the most dangerous fiction is the one we write for ourselves. I was right about that. I just did not know, when I said it, that I was also writing the syllabus for my own final examination.